Hello friends, welcome to the final episode of my series on serotonin. I assume there will be some of you that will be watching this episode and not watching the previous videos in the series. I highly recommend against that. You will be missing out on some of the easiest presentation of the research on serotonin that you can get possible. There is no audio version summary of serotonin that is easily available or understandable. There's absolutely none, of course. Long before I ever thought to research serotonin, I looked. There are some lectures, 1 hour and a half lectures or so, in which people glimpse over the research or misunderstand the research. Usually they're not neuroscientists, usually they're people involved in something else. I am not a neuroscientist, but I went very rigorously through the research. In fact, now that I'm finishing the series, I'm a little concerned. I don't really know how I'm going to be able to cite each video, because a lot of the time I have over 200 citations in this series, and a lot of the time there are so many citations for everything I'm saying, and sometimes I'm going to have to pick one citation over 3 citations for one statement, because in my actual book I have sometimes more than one citation for a certain statement, because I want evidence. I want to show that I'm not just pulling one paper out. Anyway, if I had never known about the serotonin system, this video series would have helped me a lot. And I hope it does for you too. Now, what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to summarize the actionable elements of what we discussed. Okay, so I'm not going to summarize the whole series, but I'm going to summarize the actionable parts of it, and why I'm going to explain why I am so concerned about serotonin, why I talk about serotonin a lot. So let's begin with the element of neurogenesis. Neurogenesis, or the increase of neurotrophic factors in the brain, are intimately tied with serotonin. Serotonergic activity in the brain produces neurotrophic factors. This is well established. It produces not only new neurons in adulthood, which differentiate and then proliferate through the brain to areas they're needed, but it also produces new oligodendrocytes and changes the glial cells. It does all kinds of things in the brain. What we know is that, number one, for people that are purely interested in intelligence, brain size is correlated positively with intelligence. The bigger your head, as well as the bigger your brain mass is, on average, the more intelligent you are. Brain mass is, a lot of it, composed of actual cells. Those are neurons. So on that basis, the more neurons you have in your brain, likely the more potential you have to have complex structures that help you with thinking. Beyond that, there is the concern of neurodegenerative disease, which I discussed a little bit of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease earlier in the videos, and I didn't go into too much detail about other diseases. But the important thing to know is that all neurodegenerative diseases are characterized, and by the way, we all get neurodegenerative disease. We may not have Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease, but mild cognitive decline is experienced by all people, everyone. That decline in the pathological disease states, as well as in the normal states, is characterized by a loss of neurons in the brain. Over time in life, due to traumatic injury, due to excitotoxicity, due to a lack of growth factors, we slowly lose cells in our brain. The use of something that stimulates serotonergic activity in the brain is that at least while you're losing these neurons, you're developing a little bit more than you would have otherwise. So you can attenuate the loss of cognitive function as you age past the age of, say, 20. By the age of 40, by the way, you're already less sharp. And it's not just because you haven't been in school. It's because you are actually less sharp. Your brain is less functional. And that's why mathematicians rarely, I've mentioned this earlier, rarely win the Fields Medal, which is the Nobel Prize sort of mathematics, past the age of 30. It just doesn't happen much. Even though they know more, they have more knowledge, they are less creative and less thoughtful because their brains are less functional. Because after the age of 20, you start to experience a tremendously reduced neurotrophic factors in the brain. Okay? So there's that. Another thing is plasticity of the brain. Plasticity of the brain, I've described earlier. You can think of it as having a dynamic brain, like that of a child or a teenager. A dynamic brain is a brain that can quickly it can reorganize itself according to experiences in life. So you can learn from your lessons and adapt instead of getting stuck on something and ruminating on it. Say, God forbid, you experience a divorce, which is one of the worst things that can happen for human happiness. Many people, usually people experience experience divorce in adulthood. That's when they have less neurotrophic factors. You find many divorcees very sad years after the event, thinking about it, what's called rumination. They think about it. Something could happen like that also with a bad experience with a friend or a family member or losing a job. This rarely happens to children. The reason is, I believe, that they have much higher neurotrophic factors in the brain. There is certainly a lot of evidence that major depressive disorder, which often is characterized by excessive rumination, which means thinking about subjects that upset people, the disorder is changed when SSRIs are introduced, which increase plasticity of the brain, and people are then able better to associate new experiences. So, for example, let's take this off very major events. Say you were scared of public speaking naturally. You were naturally scared of it, and then when you were younger, you did one public speaking engagement and you got terrified on stage, you had a bad experience, and now you're really terrified of public speaking. If you increase the plasticity of your brain, which means make your brain more dynamic through the use of SSRIs, which increase they increase plasticity as well as neurogenesis, which increases plasticity further, what ends up happening is that although you may not stop being afraid of going on stage and presenting your lecture to a group of people, what happens is if you then, when you're on the SSRI for over 6 months, then go on the stage and try to present it and it goes well, your brain will associate that experience with that good outcome. But if your brain is frigid or static and you go try that experience, you will be debilitated by the fear of the last experience, and even if it goes well, your brain will not associate that strongly. The basic theory in psychology of how the brain works is called association theory. Your brain associates things to each other. To allow it to reassociate faster, you need plasticity. So this is another reason. Now, I also want to mention that serotonin is intimately tied to learning and memory. Now, we have discussed this briefly before in our discussion of hormones, but essentially, most of estrogen's effects on the brain in terms of neuroprotection as well as in terms of enhancing verbal fluency and verbal memory, which you note is often better in women than in men, is due to its effect on serotonin. Serotonin is cognitive, in terms of cognitive performance, enhances performance. It's a PED, it's a performance enhancing drug. However, very high levels of serotonin in the brain and very low levels both cause less performance, not cognitive dysfunction, but less performance. So, and I've noticed that personally. If you raise your SSRI dose to a very high level, you will start to experience slightly less performance. What will happen is you will be a little bit lazier, you'll be a little bit too calm, you'll experience a little bit of brain fog. By the way, brain fog is associated with neurotrophic factors in the brain. And you'll just have a little bit less energy. Now you can combat that with other drugs, but usually a medium dose is the most efficient. Finally, neuroprotection. So SSRIs and serotonin in general are neuroprotective because not only in terms of disease states, but as we've seen in our discussion of drugs with amphetamine, SSRIs protect the brain against the neurotoxic effects of amphetamine-like substances, specifically reducing the serotonin depletion that occurs with these drugs. Now, a few more notes I want to mention. So the above, what I just described to you, is the reason why I use SSRIs. I don't use SSRIs because I'm depressed or anxious. I have been anxious before in my life, not necessarily depressed, but I've been anxious before. I have overcome a lot of psychological, difficulties, and that's one of the ways I learned about so many of these drugs. Because I'm a person that's naturally inquisitive and I research and I try to find solutions to my problems because I am unwilling to live a life that is not the best life that I can live within my means. But I don't have anxiety now at all. If I stop using a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which I have many times, I have no problems. There's not an issue there. The reason why I use this drug is because it is performance enhancing. I like to have more plasticity. I like to be able to reorganize my brain quickly. And I feel the effects. This is not some... what do they call that thing? Placebo effect, which is a real effect. Placebo effect is a real effect. You have to account for it in studies. But it's not a placebo effect. I can certainly discern the effect myself. Not only is my brain more flexible and agile and dynamic, but I really believe that it's a long-term investment in intelligence and in against cognitive decline. the increase in neurotrophic factors from SSRIs are potentially the easiest and best studied way to increase neurotrophic factors in the brain. So it is a staple to me in any cognitive enhancement package for myself. Now, cognitive enhancement protocol, I mean, not package. So that's number one. That's why I use an SSRI, basically. Number two, I choose an SSRI that has some effect on the sigma-1 receptor. Why exactly? What it exactly does at the sigma-1 receptor, I don't know. But I noticed that fluvoxamine, which has the highest effect of the sigma-1 receptor, also reduces rumination the most. And so I believe that it is having an even greater effect on the plasticity of the brain. So this is why I choose that. Now, is this the most effective way? What an SSRI does is inhibit the SERT transporter of serotonin that takes serotonin out of the synaptic cleft between neurons. Is this the most efficient way or most effective way to manipulate serotonin? I think so, but I think it could be improved. Specifically, there may be some receptors that need to be antagonized or agonized in addition to the SSRI. So far, the research is not clear enough for me to agree on doing any of that except for the 5-HT6 receptor. I do believe, also the 5-HT1A receptors. So the 5-HT6 receptor, which is involved, I've described it in detail before, but it's involved in the enhancement of cognition that comes with fasting and so on. It appears that antagonizing that receptor may be conductive to better brain health. I would like to start doing that. Unfortunately, antagonists of the 5-HT6 receptor are not pharmaceutically available right now, or not easily at least. This is something I would like to get produced for myself one day. I would like to do that, and I do antagonize the 5-HT1A receptor with the use of beta blockers. I discussed that in the second last video. Now finally, briefly, although this is discussed in the last video, I complement my use of SSRIs with, of course, I use a lot of other molecules to influence brain function, but one group of them I use specifically for the effects on serotonin in general, and that list, which I described in the last video, is zinc, saffron, inositol, a beta blocker, as well as activities like cardiovascular exercise and going out in the sunlight, which I do every morning intentionally. And in California it's pretty easy to get sunlight throughout the day, but every morning I start my day by activating that circadian rhythm by going outside. Luckily this is quite easy for me because I have to take the dogs on a walk every morning. So, two other outcomes I want to discuss. Number one, as I mentioned before several times in this series, there are a lot of people that complain about most of these people have not used SSRIs, or they've used them for 1 or 2 weeks or a month. SSRIs effects do not come before 5 months. If you experience something before 5 months, especially before 3 months, it is not the effect that you're looking for. The neurotrophic effect comes between 3 and 6 months. For most people, it takes about 5 months. So if you've taken an SSRI for 3 months, you don't know what you're talking about. Okay, number one. Number two, the effect number two, there is a very bad rap in the public among the ascientific community, people that are not involved in the research, that think that SSRIs are very bad for you, or they have horrible withdrawal or something like that. This is this is rubbish. There's a lot of rubbish being spoken of in the world because a lot of people don't read, a lot of people don't research, a lot of people don't try things for themselves, and so on. I have used SSRIs on and off for many years. I've read a lot of research on this subject. I know the subject very well. There is a difference in the effectiveness of SSRIs depending on the person. There are people that are resistant to SSRIs. Their depression does not improve that much. And this may depend on polymorphisms in their genes, including at the metabolism of the SSRIs I discussed the CYP enzymes, or by polymorphisms they have at the SERT transporter, because SSRIs target SERT. So if you have a really crappy SERT, it may improve your depression a little bit, but it's not going to do that much, right? So that's one thing. Then you may have blood barrier permeability issues. The SSRI is not getting into your brain very well. You may have many other issues in your brain genetically that make you less able to respond to an SSRI. Okay, so just because it doesn't work for you after 5 months doesn't mean that it doesn't work for other people, and doesn't mean that it may be one of the most beneficial medications ever created for people in general. In fact, It is the most effective medication in psychiatry other than atypical antipsychotics, which are basically tranquilizers given to people that have schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Other than those two things, SSRIs are the most effective medication in psychiatry, period. There's no question about that. They save lives. Well, lithium is also very effective, but it will cause kidney failure in like 10 or 20 years. But it works through serotonin also, so it belongs in this video. But SSRIs are extremely effective. They are life-saving. There are many people that had miserable lives before they started taking SSRIs. Those are for people that are anxious and depressed. But for people like me who are interested in preserving brain function for the long time, in the long term, there are very few things that are well studied that we know improve brain function like SSRIs. There are very few things. So this is one of the things we can depend on. So for those what I call SSRI haters out there, please, be thoughtful of what you're talking about when you talk. Do you really know what you're talking about? You probably don't. You probably don't. You probably haven't read 100 papers on the subject. You probably haven't taken SSRIs for years. You probably haven't seen dozens and dozens and dozens of people take SSRIs. So you may not know really what you're talking about. And in dismissing this drug to other people, you may be, first of all, for people that have anxiety or depression, you may be really harming their lives. And for people that are trying to improve their brain function, you're thwarting their attempts for no reason. Now, I recently saw an interview with a person, unfortunately I don't know his name, but I'm mentioning this because a lot of my viewers are bodybuilders or somehow involved in strength sports. And a lot of these people take steroids, hormone drugs. And a lot of these drugs, which are mostly androgenic, and a lot of these people also block estrogen in their body, which is even more troublesome. But androgenic drugs in general, not only are they damaging to some parts of the body, like the kidney, for example, but they also reduce serotonergic function in the brain specifically. And I believe, although there's very little evidence on this, but I believe that the majority of the anxiety and brain dysfunction that comes from long-term steroid use, depending on the steroid, keep in mind, there are steroids that do this more than others, and it depends on the dose, but the long-term dysfunction depends on two things. One is having a too highly active hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis due to adrenaline signaling that comes from androgens, and number two is the downregulation of serotonin receptors and reduced serotonergic activity that comes with that. So recently I saw an interview with a gentleman who competed at a show, I think in Florida recently. He competed with, God, I don't know what these guys' names are, but he's a Canadian guy who was married to Chris Bumstead's sister, I think. Anyway, this gentleman came on Dave Palumbo's show recently and was describing his anxiety in competitions and the stress he goes through right before a competition and so on. Right before a competition, bodybuilders are taking the largest amount of aromatase inhibitors, which inhibit the conversion of testosterone to estrogen, and they're taking the largest amount of very androgenic steroids. So for example, they may be taking halotestin, they may be taking trenbolone, so on. So they experience the climax of this adrenergic, serotonergic effect of steroids. And he was discussing his anxiety and how down he feels and how much he doesn't like competing. And you see this among a lot of pro bodybuilders nowadays, because they don't use the same drugs they did in the 80s. They use drugs that do this more than those drugs. So, these are the kind of people that really should be considering taking an SSRI, especially when they're taking these steroids. They can't really block the beta receptors because they want adrenaline for the physiological effects of their drugs. But the SSRI will not change the physiological effects much. It won't attenuate their depression or anxiety completely, but it will at least preserve some of the brain function and limit some of the damage they're doing to their brains. And I'm not a person who believes that steroids cause depression in general or anything like that, but the effect on serotonin is clear. So this is something that really people need to know about, and I wish people could popularize it in the bodybuilding world, because it is almost a perfect antidote to some of the mental effects of steroids. Finally, I want to talk about the the use of dietary measures to increase serotonin. And I described this earlier in the videos, particularly in the cancer and cardiovascular health video. But I want you guys to understand something. I want to make it clear here. The people who recommend taking 5-HTP as a supplement for enhancing sleep do not understand sleep or serotonin. in general. You guys can go to my video on circadian serotonin, which was an earlier video I made, and learn about how complex the interaction is between I didn't even mention melatonin in that video. Melatonin is derived of serotonin. I didn't even mention that. But the complex interaction between serotonin, which governs the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain, which is the governor of the circadian rhythms of the body, the master clock, and the master clock's effect through sunlight on serotonin, there's an interplay there. It's very complicated. They don't understand that, but they also don't understand the serious risks in terms of health, in terms of cancer, and in terms of cardiovascular disease, which are the two main killers. When blood serotonin levels are high, we do not want to increase serotonin in the body. We want to increase its activity in the brain, not its transmission, its activity. That's why we use a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. We don't use something that just causes serotonin to be released, like MDMA. We don't use that, do we? And we don't use tryptophan or 5-HTP, which 5-HTP bypasses the tryptophan hydroxylase enzyme, which is the rate-limiting enzyme in the synthesis of serotonin. We don't use that either because that just causes more transmission, more synthesis, which will cause an effect that is not sustainable. The effect that will cause in the brain, by the way, is an effect that's characterized by something called tachyphylactis, something like that, which means basically when you take a drug and the effects reduce over time, so you have to keep taking a higher dose of the drug, which is like a downregulation of receptors, but other things happen as well. I forgot what the word is, but the point is that will happen in the brain. But when you take 5-HTP, this is the problem. It's not going just to the brain. You're eating it, it's going in your body. Tryptophan hydroxylase 1 is also going to convert that, it bypasses tryptophan hydroxylase 1 anyway. So it's going to be converted directly into serotonin in the body. In fact, that serotonin is not going to be taken to the brain. So some of the 5-HTP will be taken across the blood-brain barrier into the brain probably. But the point is you're going to get systemic serotonin across the body. And when you get that, you get all kinds of fibrotic issues, you get any kinds of risks with regard to your heart, you get all of the cancer risks at a much higher rate than if you just increased serotonergic activity in your brain, right? So please guys, I made a video before on ashwagandha and 5-HTP because someone asked about it, and I briefly mentioned there, hey guys, 5-HTP is not the way to go. But the thing is, I couldn't explain it in detail because I knew that the audience doesn't understand all of this background information. So I already had these notes ready then, and these notes were ready before that video by far, months before that video. And it's been like 6 months I've been on YouTube, and I probably did this in the second month. But the point is, now you guys know the background, so you can understand, wait a minute, why am I taking 5-HTP and increasing blood serotonin levels? Then any side effect I could get is going to be higher. Whatever side effect you could get from an SSRI is going to be higher in the body when you take 5-HTP in a dietary form. So 5-HTP can still be useful if for some reason, and what would really be more useful is tryptophan, because you want that rate-limiting enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase to moderate how much serotonin being produced. But in the case that your serotonin was depleted, that's when you may want to use it. So for example, if you did something very neurotoxic, if you went to Burning Man in Reno, Nevada and used a bunch of MDMA, you may want to use tryptophan or 5-HTP to recharge, particularly tryptophan, after you finish the event. But there is no other reason that you would ever want to use that, and it's specifically not to enhance sleep or something like that, because the side effects are just too major. So anyway, guys, I hope that you got something out of this series. For those of you that watched the whole series, congratulations. You now know more about serotonin than your psychiatrist, probably. That doesn't mean that you can go prescribe SSRIs or controlled substances to yourself. That just means that now you know the dangers. You know about the DNA damage to sperm. You know about the potential cancer effects. You know about the potential cardiovascular effects. You know about the change in the QT interval. You know about which SSRIs are most associated with gastrointestinal distress, which are most associated with every other kind of side effect possible. I've mentioned all of them, what is the best and worst there. You know now about how complex the effects of serotonin in the body are, and how estrogen's effects in the brain are basically determined by serotonin, other than its small antioxidant effect. and its effect on this estrogen receptor, which in the end causes a serotonergic effect. Basically, you know that serotonin is one of the most important neurotransmitters in the body and in the brain specifically, and something that you should always be aware of. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you benefited from this. If you did, please like and tell other people, like the video and tell other people about the video. I assume the series will get very few views. So if you did like it, make sure you liked all the videos and did your best to promote the channel, because it's hard for me to promote the channel. Thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you next time.